Hello everyone and welcome to the Chelsea History Festival for this week's Friday Insight slot. Today I am delighted to welcome Ben Barry. Ben is a Senior Fellow of the Land Warfare and International Institute for Strategic Studies. Before this, he served in the British Army, where he commanded an armoured infantry battalion and a multinational brigade of the United Nations and Nato operations in Bosnia. He is the author of the acclaimed book, Blood, Metal and Dust, How Victory Turned into Defeat, Afghanistan and Iraq. Today, Ben will be examining the successes and failures of the British Army across the last half-century of its history, exploring how society, technology, and the character of conflict have changed over the past 50 years. He is hosted by my boss, Dr. Glyn Prissell. Glyn is the Assistant Director here at the National Army Museum, a historian specialising in modern British history. He previously served as Chief Historian at the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and he is the author of Citizen Sailors, the Royal Navy and the Second World War. You can buy a purchase of the book, Rise and Fall of the British Army, at the Chelsea History Festival bookshop, just up the stairs, following on for the event. Ben will be signing copies. All purchases not only support Ben and his publishers, but also the work of the Chelsea History Festival. We anticipate time for questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone over to you just so that everyone in the room and online can hear you. With all that said, I'll now pass over to Glyn and Ben. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. It's always dangerous giving Thomas the microphone in case he says nasty things, but you did well. You did well there. Thank you all for coming today. We're conscious the room is quite warm. If you do need to leave and go and get a glass of water, we won't hold that against you. Please do make yourselves comfortable. And as Thomas said, we're delighted to have Ben Barry with us for this premiere slot in the Chelsea History Festival. And what we're going to do is Ben is going to talk us through the book in very general terms. And then because I have a microphone strapped to my face, I'll use my privilege to ask a couple of questions before we throw out to the audience. And it was very sobering, I think, to read the book and to realise that the book charts a period in which Britain went from 5% of GDP spent on defence to a situation today where we have 2.3%. Maybe 2.5 in a couple of years if we're lucky. But the book isn't just about reductions in funding, it's also about operations, the institution, and of course the people themselves who make up this wonderful institution of ours. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ben to talk you through the book.
Well, thanks very much. Is my sound all right? Yeah. Well, very good to see all of you here, and welcome to those who are tuning in through cyberspace. Well, I served from 1975 to 2010, learning a great deal. I was encouraged, educated, and worked with many inspiring people in the light infantry and right across the arms and services of the Army. I had some great adventures on training and on operations and made some great friends. And my subsequent career at IISS enabled me to continue that contact with the Army. Now, in this half-decade, Britain's enemies, its friends, its society, its technology, all changed greatly, and the Army changed a great deal. Now, although the book covers the contributions of many regiments and people, rank ranged from private to full general, the book's a history of the Army as a whole. The story is one of great achievements, often on difficult missions. But some histories of the Army and some memoirs read like love letters. I'm more of a critical friend, identifying successes, but also identifying failures by the Army, MOD, and the British government. And these failures produced operational failure and resulted in avoidable casualties. And I do name names. Sorry, we seem to be going backwards, but never mind. Yes. Small amount of friction. Yep, there we are. So I'll let you digest these statistics, which are taken from two very good graphics that Osprey had drawn up that are in the front of the book. So it's a story of combat, change, continuity, but also of contraction. And the slide illustrates the contraction over the 50 years. So that's why Rise and Fall is in the title, because the half-century saw the Army's fighting power grow to a high point followed by a plateau, then a decline, which is yet to be turned around. Similar stories could be told about the Navy and the Air Force, but this is the Army's wonderful museum with its amazing archive. Now, a country can have any number of defence policies, strategies, management plans, as well as inspiring rhetoric by its politicians and senior military. But if its armed forces can't successfully fight, the money spent is wasted. From Bosnia onwards, the army encountered other armies who would not fight, or whose governments wouldn't let them fight. Now, we're lucky that the army and the great majority of its people has a culture of thirsting for action, adventure, and combat, wanting to scatter our enemies and frustrate their knavish tricks, to quote the unfashionable second verse of the national anthem. I found frustrating enemy knavish tricks in Belfast and Bosnia very rewarding. So my centre of gravity is the British Army's campaigns, operations and battles. And I salute those who soldiered in these operations, particularly the increasingly difficult and unpopular wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also the families of those who never made it back. I cover major army operations and some smaller operations that have special significance, such as Macedonia in 2001. I also cover the Army's battles against 3 viruses, foot and mouth, Ebola and COVID. But I've not covered all security, evacuation, disaster relief, engineering, advisory and training operations conducted in that period. I apologise for the omission to those who participated. I show the Army changing, adapting and innovating. Many initiatives were successful, but sometimes the Army failed to innovate or adapt fast enough. So I begin with the Cold War Army. This was a larger, different army from a different society. Compared with today, for example, it smoked and drank more, was less fit overall, and could show sexism, racism, and homophobia. But the Army's main effort was defending northwest Germany from the numerically superior Warsaw Pact land and air forces. It had to do this, a corps of 3 armoured and 1 infantry divisions, and these were at very high readiness, at 4 hours' notice to get into a survival area in the event of a surprise attack. And they also conducted much collective training and exercises at battle group level in Canada, seen here, and at brigade, divisional and corps level, a level that has never been achieved since the end of the Cold War. So I analyse 4 major field exercises of the Cold War. 1 divisional, 2 corps exercises, and 1 army group exercise. And this is the Army's own graphic from Exercise Lionheart, which I participated in 1984. We've got a map showing this in the book, but it is of note that at the height of the exercise, there were 131,000 people in the exercise area, which spanned from Ostend to close to the East German border. And that's 60,000 regulars, 40,000 TA and reserves who were mobilised and deployed to their battle positions over a single weekend, and 30,000 people from the RAF and NATO. These manoeuvres over the autumnal German countryside tested plans, tactics, deployment, logistics, and they tested commanders. There was real fog of war, friction and pressure. Lessons were learned and implemented. And the Territorial Army part-timers were extraordinarily well integrated into the Army, and exercises with mobilisation and deployment often tested a level of operational integration which I'm not sure we have today. There were Cold War experiments and innovations, including in tactics, equipment, for example, the initiative on the counterstroke, the formation of an experimental air mobile brigade that I served in, the formation of a hybrid regular reserve infantry division for rear area security, and a quiet revolution in battlefield logistics. Now, during the 1980s, the Army's fighting power considerably increased, and the second chapter of the book that covers the Cold War is headed The Bagnall Revolution, reflecting General Sir Nigel Bagnall's leadership of a period of tactical innovation and a revolution in doctrine for armoured warfare. And the Thatcher government's rising defence budget funded new weapons, including Challenger tanks, Warrior infantry fighting vehicles, and the MLRS rocket launcher. Many troops countered terrorism in Northern Ireland. In the early 1970s, inadequate strategy and some of the things the army did, like internment, made the situation worse, which made the army's job more difficult. But by the late 70s, ends, ways and means were pretty much in balance. There were many innovations in Northern Ireland, including patrol tactics, search, countering improvised explosive devices, intelligence, overt and covert surveillance, and indeed a masterful way of organising covert operations. These and considerable government and army strategic patience helped eventually to bring that conflict to an end, for which both John Major and Tony Blair deserve enormous credit. Now, the army determinedly rose to the unanticipated challenge of the Falklands War, marching to the sound of the guns. The army components of the Royal Marines Commando Brigade, 2 battalions of the Parachute Regiment, and the SAS were the army's cutting edge. And you can see some paras at the top of this slide, and the Scots Guards on top of Mount Tumbledown, a very hard-fought battle at the bottom. I do take a critical view, though, of the 5th Infantry Brigade, the 2nd Army Brigade sent to the Falklands. I make a judgment that assigning the least ready brigade in the army at the time, with no organic logistics, to be the National Strategic Reserve, and then sending it to fight in such challenging circumstances, was the direct responsibility of the then Army Chief, General Bramall. Now, this judgment may make some uncomfortable, but the evidence I've found is overwhelming. In 1990, the army was at the height of its Cold War power. In 1990 and 91, it was tested by an utterly unexpected mission to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait as part of a US-led coalition. The army's contribution was a considerable success, albeit with the army's 3 armoured divisions having to be cannibalised to generate the single modernised 1st Armoured Division that fought in Iraq. The 1st Armoured Division quickly destroyed multiple Iraqi positions, much more quickly and with less casualties than many expected. Now, this was the high watermark of British armoured warfare capability, and a theme throughout the book is armoured warfare. I begin with the Army's practice of armoured warfare in the Cold War, the utility of armour in both Iraq wars, the Balkans, Afghanistan, and currently in helping NATO deter Russia. The Army invented the tank in the First World War, and in 1990 it had 800 of these. Shortly, it'll have only 150 in just 2 regiments. Getting the division of 30,000 troops, 6,000 vehicles, almost 1,000 armoured, and 25,000 tonnes of supplies 400 kilometres east of where it landed in Saudi Arabia, and sustaining it over a subsequent 300 kilometres of a fighting advance was an amazing achievement by army logisticians, and I don't think it's widely enough understood. So I hope I've done it justice by spelling it out in the book, both with text and a map. And even with 34,000 troops in the Gulf, the army still sustained its other commitments to NATO and to Northern Ireland. But after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, the British government understandably wanted a peace dividend. And I cover the Options for Change Defence Review, which shrank the conventional capabilities of the army by 1/3, troop numbers reducing to just over 100,000. And this is the only photograph I'll show you that I actually took on a bloody cold day in January 1996. But the foundations that were laid down in the 1980s still underpinned the army's success in facing down brutal warlords in the unanticipated and difficult UN and NATO operations in Bosnia. And at the height of the campaign in 1996, the army deployed over 10,000 troops to Bosnia, including the newly created British-led HQ Allied Commander Rapid Reaction Corps, which still exists and lives in Gloucester, HQ of the 3rd Division, an armoured brigade, and the full range of combat and logistics support and adequate combat supplies. George Robertson's 1998 Strategic Defence Review resulted in the Army reorganising to better conduct joint and expeditionary operations, but it was never adequately funded by the unsympathetic Chancellor, Gordon Brown. More rapid interventions were mounted in Kosovo, then Sierra Leone, and in these, Generals Jackson, Dannett and Richards played key roles, not least General Jackson refusing to obey a reckless NATO order to confront Russian troops in Pristina Airport. All three of these generals would command the army from 2003 to 2010 to great effect. After 9/11, the army played the leading role in setting up the International Security Assistance Force in Kabul in Afghanistan in 2002. In Basra in 2003, it masterminded a 21st century smart siege that captured the city without turning it into rubble. These successes were again built on the Army's Cold War legacy. Now, the reduction in violence in Northern Ireland by that time meant that a 100,000 strong army could just about sustain these commitments and their other commitments. So I think this period from 1990 to 2003 was a high plateau of military achievement. It gave the army justified self-confidence. But in retrospect, many of those who opposed the British Army were not first-rate, highly motivated enemies. They were second-rate or third-rate who, when confronted with joined-up British Army operations, often sought an excuse to be somewhere else. But I did see overconfidence and complacency sometimes in the Army, the Ministry of Defence and government. There then followed 2 decades of descent from this peak plateau of operational effectiveness. There was a secret defence review over 2003-2004, which cut the armed forces again. Tony Blair tolerated this, and this directly resulted in further cuts to the Army's troop numbers and budget, and a consequence was the lack of helicopters available to support troops in Afghanistan in the early part of the British operation there. I analysed the Army operations in Iraq and also in Helmand up to 2014. I continue the story of Helmand after the British withdrew, a story that's been hardly covered by the British media. And I continue that story until the Taliban took over Helmand and then defeated NATO, the US and UK by taking the country over in 2001. And of course, during this period, there was a slow-burning strategic shock because the British forces encountered enemies who were prepared to stand and fight and be killed and didn't run away. And stabilisation of Iraq and Afghanistan saw increasing misalignment between ends, ways and means, resulting in strategic failure. The principal responsibility for this lies fairly and squarely on the leadership, or lack of it, by Blair and Brown, and the rotating cast of defence ministers, and with some senior leaders in the MOD. But the Army was sometimes guilty of over-optimism and moving too slowly to adapt quickly enough. There were many tactical successes, and many of the negative factors were out of the Army's control. And these wars resulted in declining political, public and media support for putting British troops in harm's way. And we still sometimes see this caution displayed by the political class. And I know for those who served there, particularly those who were wounded and the families of friends of those who were killed, these will be very bitter findings. The 2008 economic crisis led to defence cuts by David Cameron's coalition government. And these again reduced the Army's strength and capabilities by another third. And botched equipment programmes such as Ajax Scout Vehicle and the persistent failure to fund sufficient training and logistic stockpiles greatly eroded Army readiness. And throughout the last decade, there were further cuts to the Army's budget and troop numbers. Now, this was concurrent with 2 challenges to morale, retention and recruiting. The first comes from what I can only describe as crap contracts. For example, the contractorisation of recruiting and the contractorisation of maintenance of married quarters and barracks, both contracts that seriously, significantly failed to perform adequately underperformance that seemed to be tolerated by the MOD and with the acquiescence of the Treasury. Now, early in my career in Northern Ireland, I'd seen female soldiers and officers in cutting-edge roles in intelligence gathering and in covert operations. So I personally welcomed the removal of all restrictions on women's roles in the army. And I was especially delighted, as you can see on the right-hand slide, to see women passing P Company, the parachute regiment's ferocious selection. So I found reports of sexual harassment of female soldiers documented by inquests, inquiries, and Anthony King's recently released 2022 report truly shocking, particularly how some male instructors at Sandhurst and Lark Hill lost their moral compasses. If it was so easy for the instructor to disobey rules in barracks, would they obey orders in battle, fighting to the death if required? Now, I know the Army set out to put this right, and there's been much hard work and effort by the Army chiefs. But if the culture of Sandhurst instructors was investigated, or disciplinary action or sackings occurred, this has never been made public. Now, my story concludes in the last 5 years. In 2021, there was an integrated review of defence and security advocated by Boris Johnson, with the statement shown. But it had many innovative ideas, including the new Ranger Regiment. But it further reduced the size of the army to 75,000 regulars and 30,000 reserves, and cut more combat capabilities, including the Warrior Infantry fighting vehicle. And by the way, no other NATO army has abandoned infantry fighting vehicles. In fact, they're rolling off the production lines right now as they're investing in more of them in Europe. So the Russian attack on Ukraine forced the government to confront the inconvenient truth that the army's capability had greatly reduced, and its readiness, or rather the lack of it, was laid bare by last year's House of Commons Defence Committee report, Ready for War, ? Now, the army had long told the MOD that of the 3 British services, it was the least modernised, with much key equipment either obsolete or approaching obsolescence. This inconvenient truth was now undeniable, and it was exacerbated by donation of army weapons to Ukraine, including all its AS-90 medium artillery. So 52 guns were sent and have only been replaced by 14 guns. Now, it's not clear to me that the army has sufficient ammunition, medical support, spare parts, and is sufficiently well trained to actually deploy with full combat capability, for example, to the mooted European Reassurance Force in Ukraine, at the same strength as it deployed to Bosnia in 1996. And it's an inconvenient truth that most European armies don't do enough training. But the British Army, that has prided itself and sought to be a partner to the US, is doing far less exercising at formation level than the US Army. And naval and air force equipment is more modern than that of the Army. And in the UK defence industry, with a reduction in size of the Army and its equipment holding, the land sector of it has also greatly reduced, and it lacks the political support and influential lobbies of the shipbuilding and aerospace industries. Now, this reduction of the Army's combat power by more than half results from continual shrinkage of the defence budget. And since 1991, successive governments have been content with strategic shrinkage, even though ministers have often publicly denied that there is strategic shrinkage. So that's denied the government many capabilities that previously had enormous utility. So, in 2025, the new Labour government conducted another strategic defence review, and a modest increase to defence spending was announced. But as the excellent report published this morning by the Institute of Fiscal Studies shows, that if it does meet the NATO target for defence spending by 2035, it will cumulatively be a significant increase in defence spending, And I'd commend the report to you, and there's a very good executive summary on its page on the IFS website. Now, the Strategic Defence Review set the Army a very challenging mission of providing a strategic reserve corps of 2 modernised divisions to NATO and a full suite of core capability, as well as sustaining its commitments to Estonia and Poland. Now, I judge to deliver this requires a massive increase in readiness, particularly stockpiles, rebuilding medical capability, and restoring Cold War levels of exercising. Now, I also think to do it properly requires about 15,000 more regular troops and a much more capable Army reserve. Now, if the Army is not allowed to grow, it needs to make even better use of advanced and emerging technology. And the current Army Chief, General Sir Rowley Walker, who actually appears 3 times in 3 different capacities, 3 different roles in the book, has set out an ambitious vision for radical change, including making increasing use of drones, artificial intelligence, and deep strike weapons. And this is being actually actively tested by an exciting experimentation task force. And there is also modernisation of some of the Army's fighting equipment, including Ajax, Challenger, and Boxer vehicles. And the Army's just taken delivery of 50 top-of-the-range modern Apache attack helicopters. But many important capability gaps remain, not least in infantry fighting vehicles. So the government, the MOD, and the Army will need to rapidly up their game. And without a significant injection of additional money, which the IFS report shows in time should be there if the government meets their pledges, but there also needs to be a ruthless pruning of the paralysing overgrowth of bureaucracy and red tape. And it's not clear right now how the decline in the Army's strength and fighting power can be reversed, because it's still going like that. And what is needed is for it to level out and then start climbing up the other side. Now, getting this right is not impossible, but it's necessary to maximise the chance of the Army succeeding on operations and also growing as a valuable living institution. So this will need leadership from Number 10, Whitehall, the MOD, and Army headquarters. It will also require the understanding and support of the British public. And the book finishes with a short quote from one of our premier military historians, Sir Max Hastings, who assessed that the British Army still represents one of our finest national institutions, but it won't remain so unless we, the British people, afford to it the attention, resources, and respect which it so richly deserves. We won't deserve future military triumphs to add to those of the past unless we provide to those who secure them the means to sustain their great heritage, a heritage which is wonderfully celebrated in this remarkable museum.
Well, Ben, I think you've given us a fantastic overview there, packed a lot in, of 50 years of history, which is amazingly varied, remarkably challenging at many times, with certain key individuals who've helped to steer the Army through this period. And we're here, of course, as part of the Chelsea History Festival. And I wanted to begin by asking you about history. I mean, I think everyone in this room, I'd like to think, would agree that history and a historical understanding is very important. And of course, this 50 years from 1975 to 2025 saw the moving on of the wartime generation, the introduction of a new generation of soldiers. But I was particularly struck by your discussion of Nigel Bagnall's reforms and how far he was influenced and inspired by a historical understanding and a historical thinking, and in many ways a deep reflection on history, everything from tank battles on the Eastern Front to the Arab-Israeli conflict, even Marlborough and his campaigns. So how far do you think that history and that historical thinking was significant in driving those reforms? And was Bagnall unusual, do you feel, as being a historically minded senior officer?
Well, I know quite a few military historians, and the military education I had, particularly at the Army Staff College and the Joint Staff College when I did the Higher Command and Staff course, there was a lot of history used for examples, and you were made to do historical case studies yourself. Although a cynical military historian involved with the Army would say too often Army officers come up with wizard new ideas, then go to the military historian and say, can you give me 3 examples that support this idea? And don't really want to hear about examples that threaten the idea. But you're right, Bagnall, who's a very unusual Army leader, because he was very iconoclastic and nearly got himself sacked as a brigadier for making outspoken remarks. When he became commander of 1st British Corps, he felt that the Corps plan wouldn't let the Corps survive for long enough to stop the big Russian forces that were coming at it, resulting in nuclear weapons having to be used too early. And his thinking about this was informed by deep personal study. He'd studied various German army defensive battles on the Eastern Front. He'd also studied the manoeuvrist campaigns of Marlborough. He'd also done a dissertation while at Oxford or Cambridge called The Israeli Army: A Study in Quality, which analysed why Israelis had succeeded against numerically superior, better equipped enemies in their wars in 1956 and 67 and 73. And that led him to conclude that the army needed to become more manoeuvrist. And he made history fashionable. And this led to example for the reappointment for a full-time historian at the Army Staff College, there not having been one there for about 100 years. And I think that was all very positive. One of the things I also cover in the book, though, is negative, in that there are all sorts of ways that in the first part of the Iraq War and Afghanistan, the British Army struggled, and it often struggled for self-imposed reasons, and it had institutionally forgotten about counterinsurgency. And this is directly attributable to the importance and success of peace operations, peace support operations in Bosnia and Kosovo in the 1990s. So when the 3 armed forces staff colleges were crashed together, what had been a week on counterinsurgency and a week on Northern Ireland in the Army Staff Course was abandoned. And there was no teaching of counterinsurgency at all to the whole college, and merely a day allocated to it for army officers. And so as all sorts of American military intellectuals realized that Iraq was becoming an insurgency and self-educated themselves, the British Army didn't. And there was a period in the middle, sort of 2004, 2005, where leading American military thinkers who'd rapidly self-educated themselves on counterinsurgency felt they had a better understanding of counterinsurgency than their British opposite numbers, and that the British also were relying too much on Northern Ireland experience, many of which misinformed as much as it informed.
And I think we can all agree that more historians are always good, but I think it's using that history in an effective way. And I mean, I did wonder what you felt about heritage and tradition more generally in the army. You write about the amalgamation of infantry regiments, for example, and earlier we were talking about the example of 16 Air Assault Brigade and the lineage, and that the use and perhaps abuse of tradition. I mean, how far do you feel that heritage and tradition has hampered change or innovation in the army, or is this in some ways a tradition of adaptation that we see in the army, particularly during this period?
Well, the answer is yes and no. We British people are intensely tribal. You know, you see that in football. You see it with regional identity of the 4 nations, and we're also very clubbable. You know, thousands of clubs and societies will meet this evening all over the country on a wide range of different topics. And in the book, I draw on a very good description of the regimental system by General Sir Simon Mayle, who heads up the museum. And it's something almost undefinable, but there are times when it adds value. It can also get in the way, but the better leaders can always make it a force multiplier. You know, the more unimaginative and the more cautious can sometimes fall back on it, as a drunk man using a lamppost for support rather than illumination. I do talk briefly in the book of the reorganisation of the infantry regimental system that General Jackson masterminded in 2004, and I have to declare up front that I was part of the work that led to the creation of the rifles, as I was deputy colonel, i.e. deputy tribal leader of the light infantry at the time, and I think the rifles has been a very successful amalgamation. What, though, I think galls many of my chums in the army is that the media always focus, whenever the army contracts, on infantry regiments. The major contractions of the army have produced huge contractions and amalgamations and mergers of the Royal Armoured Corps, who have reduced proportionally even more than the infantry, and also very historic engineer and artillery regiments have greatly contracted, for example, with artillery batteries, which is the centre of identity of the Royal Artillery, all being marched off. I think, though, you know, not only has, for example, the creation of the rifles, or indeed the Duke of Lancaster Regiment, who are on the front cover of the book, their first ever Freedom of Bolton on returning from Afghanistan, their first tour in Afghanistan. I think the creation of two new regiments during the 1990s, the Adjutant General's Corps, which was basically all staff and administrative people and personnel people, and particularly the Royal Logistic Corps, which brought together 5 former corps of logistics. To my mind, they've been very successful, and I was actually rather heartened to see recently that what had been 5 different medical branches were all merged into a single unified army medical services with a single cap badge and a stylish new grey beret. And I'm sure that will work well. But, you know, as the army's contracted, it's had to be cruel to itself about its regimental system.
And of course, for a museum curator, a new cap badge means that we have to acquire a new hat for the display at the front here. I wanted to touch a little bit on, we talked a lot about challenges, but I thought perhaps we could reflect a little bit on the other theme of the book in many ways, which is excellence, and some of the things that the army has done well during this period, and perhaps causes for optimism. I mean, I think there was a photo earlier of Battis, the Centre of Excellence in Canada, some of the inspirational leaders that the army has had during this time. I was particularly struck by your sporting metaphor. The RAF in some ways is like a Formula One team with a driver and a pit crew. The Royal Navy more like a rowing team with a cox. The army more like a rugby team. But as a fan of the Welsh rugby team, perhaps not the best example to use for the army. But talk to us a little bit about some of what you regard as the most significant achievements of the army during your period. And what does the army look like when it's successful? You know, we talked about lethality, but also plain English. I'm not sure whether the two are in contradiction there. So talk to us a little bit about what the army has done well and what we should carry forward and be inspired by as we look ahead.
Well, although I've covered many problems the army had, some of which were its own makings and some failures, you know, the story is overwhelmingly positive. You know, if someone had spent a life, 50 years in the army and had been on every operation, they would have had the most amazing life. And, you know, it's quite striking, Professor King's report, where he looks deeply at the problem of sort of ingrained discrimination against female soldiers, which is a contributing factor to these disgraceful sexual harassment cases, he makes the point that 90% of his interviews with women were overwhelmingly positive. Phrases like "fantastic career," I'd get my daughter into the army in a nanosecond if I could. I think what success looks like actually is this. It's that. At the bottom you have Scots Guards who've just fought a really tough night battle and who've gone in about 6 weeks from being parade ground soldiers down the road at Chelsea Barracks to storming Mount Tumbledown in a really difficult battle. And you can see they're elated. I mean, they're the ones who survived, of course, but they are elated. And the picture above is also significant because those are soldiers from 2 Para waiting to get on a helicopter to go and fight their second battle, the only major unit in the Falklands War that fought 2 battles. Now, Professor Richard Holmes often said that asking someone who's fought 1 battle to fight a second battle is like inviting someone to insert their fingers into a damp live electric socket. And I've sometimes felt like that in Northern Ireland and Bosnia and an adventure I had in the Middle East. And that's what success looks like. And we also saw it throughout this story, including some remarkable tactical successes and battles fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think what success also looks like is army soldiers as carefully as they can slaughtering cattle and building mass funeral pyres on the hills of England during the foot and mouth crisis. And there's all sorts of accounts by farmers who were losing their livelihood of how much comfort they took from the army's professionalism. What it also looks like is the operation, which was a joint operation, but mainly army, and it was an interagency operation with DFID and the NHS to stop Ebola in Sierra Leone. Now, this was a fantastic achievement because all the expert advice from the best epidemiologists in the UK was that as the military deployed in Sierra Leone, the virus was winning and they weren't likely to stop it. But in cooperation with the Sierra Leonean army, which had been built up over the previous 15 years by the British, they were able to do this. And then again, COVID. Now, political views are different about the overall strategic leadership and management of COVID, and it'll be interesting to see what the inquiry concludes. But having the military there as a calm, capable backstop who knew how to get things done. And at the height of COVID, and the height of difficulty in government, which coincides with the time when the Prime Minister had COVID and nearly died and was then recovering, there were 5 military planning teams led by army brigadiers in 5 of the government departments, helping them to plan, to manage a crisis, both in terms of running the current operation and planning for the future, in a way those government departments under pressure weren't equipped to do. So that's what I think success looks like.
Very well said. And it reminds us of the importance of the connection between the army and the society from which it's drawn. And as you said,